Greetings and welcome. Thank you so much for joining. This is Nader Nanjiani, and with us is Dr. Ian Foster, today's presenter. Welcome to our AWS Research Seminar Series, this being the fifth of our monthly webinars that we conduct with researchers and scientists who've done exceptionally well in the area. So with that, allow me to quickly introduce you to today's topic and today's speaker, Dr. Ian Foster. Dr. Ian Foster is a director at Argonne Data Science and Learning Division at the Argonne National Lab, and he is a distinguished service professor of computer science at the University of Chicago. As part of his responsibilities, he also leads an organization called Globus, which is focused on improving data-driven collaboration. Hence the topic of today's webinar is a simplified approach to data-driven research collaboration. When scientists can move and share data quickly, easily, and securely, that accelerates the pace of research and innovation. So the Globus program that Ian leads has more than 100,000 users at thousands of organizations worldwide. And what makes this research data management service unique and how it meets various compliance requirements and how it supports common use cases and some of the success stories is what we'll talk about today. They, of course, also use AWS, so we'll get to learn more about the experience of that. So with those words, I'd hand over to Ian, but before I do that, let me tell you that you have the option to ask questions, and you can do so by simply hitting the Q&A button and going ahead and asking the question. And the slides, if you're interested, will be available after the session posted, along with the recording of this webinar. So with that, it's over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about this topic of research data management. So let me start off just by saying a few words about what this Globus system is that I'm going to describe, and then I'll sort of drill down into why we developed it and how people are using it. So, first of all, what is Globus in one slide? It's a service that allows researchers, institutions to obtain unified access to research data, regardless of where it's located, whether it's on cloud storage, institutional storage, a storage within a single lab or on someone's laptop. Transfer, share, and publish those data, either from a web client or a command line. And then it's also, because it's got powerful APIs, it's a tool that you can use to build your own research data management applications. So how do you access this? Well, Globus is operated by my group at the University of Chicago as we say here, a not-for-profit service for the research community. So you can think of us, if you're a biomedical researcher, as a core that we just operate for the research community as a whole. The next slide just gives you a little bit of background in terms of scale. So it's software as a service. I'll say more about that in a minute. It's hosted on the Amazon cloud, it turns out. You access it using web clients or command line tools. 120,000 registered users, 20,000, more than 20,000 active endpoints, storage systems that are accessible via Globus, and thousands of institutions that operate Globus endpoints to support their users. And then on the left-hand side, we see a range of different APIs that power users can use to do interesting things. But let's move on and say a bit about who I am and how I got involved in this process. So as was noted, I have two affiliations. I'm at the University of Chicago Downtown Chicago is not quite as close as this picture makes it look, but we're slightly south of Chicago, a research institution with some very distinguished researchers, a large biomedical and physical sciences, and actually social sciences, research community, people who generate large amounts of data and share those data with people around the world. I'm also located at Argonne National Lab, about 25 miles, 40 kilometers outside Chicago, which is a research lab operated by the Department of Energy for the physical sciences community. Primarily, it operates large facilities such as the Advanced Photon Source in the upper center and the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility in the bottom right, both sources of enormous amounts of data. So here's a picture of the Advanced Photon Source, 60 beam lines or so, each generating data sometimes at tens of gigabytes per second, and the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility, soon to be home to a exascale computer, a computer that can operate at 10 to the 18th operations per second. And if you read the fine print here, you'll see that it's a system that's not only used for high performance computing, but also increasingly for AI applications, deep neural networks, inference and training and related activities. So this working with these sorts of communities, observing how they do science, we see that people increasingly need to be able to do a number of things that, for various reasons, are harder, much harder than they really should be. They, first of all, need to be able to access data in many different places. So, for example, at the Advanced Photon Source, people generate data, terabytes or gigabytes or terabytes, and then need to be able to transfer it to their home computing infrastructure, perhaps to a public cloud, perhaps to their individual, their personal research lab, perhaps to a national supercomputing facility. These are all things that sadly are still sometimes done by porting USB drives rather than moving the data over the network. So that's one problem that we seek to address so as to reduce the friction associated with research. Another thing that people need to be able to do is to share data with collaborators and research communities. For example, having generated a data set at the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility or in a genomics lab at the University of Chicago, they need to be able to share it often in a very carefully controlled manner, but nevertheless, we hope frictionless way with other partners at other institutions. And then finally, and I've already sort of referred to this, we increasingly see people needing to be able to share, move, manage, and share data from scientific instruments that are generating data at ever increasing rates. You know, the Advanced Photon Source, for example, new instruments can generate data at tens of gigabytes per second. Cryo-EM devices, of course, can generate data in enormous volumes and so forth. And they want to be able to seamlessly move those data among different locations. Now, you know, it's amazing really to think how much the underlying networks have evolved in the last, say, 40 years. It's not that long ago, say 30 years ago, we could move data at perhaps 9,600 bits per second. Now a lot of research institutions have 100 gigabit per second networks, opening up the possibility of moving petabytes in a relatively short amount of time. But you can't do that without the right tools, and that's where Globus comes in. So what we'd really like then is, if we were to use an Amazon analogy, a unifying, simplifying data fabric that would allow researchers to state, perhaps by speaking to someone, but at least by clicking a button on a web page, or by typing a command, share data with Jane, move my data to Amazon S3, move my experiment data to my lab server, without having to engage in any negotiation with any infrastructure providers, and with this occurring near the peak speed of the underlying network. Well, Alexa won't let us do that so far, but Globus will, and that's what I'm going to describe to you. We got started in this business of moving data a long time ago, actually close to 25 years ago, when we started working with the high-energy physics community, who were at that point starting to develop infrastructure for processing data from the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland. And they had this interesting problem. They were generating petabytes of data, or they were planning to generate petabytes of data at that time. Now they are. And they needed to distribute these data to hundreds of institutions worldwide, where thousands of scientists would be engaging in analyzing those data. So the first version of what we came to call Globus was built for that purpose, in fact, distributing data from scientific, in particular physics experiments. The resulting system, as Rolf Herr, the CERN Director General, said, played an important role in discovery of the Higgs boson. But once that work had been done and completed, we realized that there was a need for many more people to be able to use these seamless data movement capabilities, and to be able to use them in a way that did not require the expertise of thousands of physical scientists working together in international collaborations. And that's what led to us to establish the Globus service. So actually in 2010, we decided we would reinvent Globus, not as a piece of software, a toolkit that you download and install yourself, but as a cloud service. And I'll explain exactly how that works in a minute. But first of all, let me show you the sorts of things that it lets you do. So here we have a scientific instrument, a compute facility. A user is initiating a transfer request, much as you would with a utility like the secure copy utility. However, you can authenticate with your own credentials, move data to any storage system, and do so at high speeds, as well as securely. So transfer data. Once you've transferred it somewhere, you can then say that you want someone else to be able to access those data, so you can share it with other people without them having to have an account on your computer. Globus then controls access to the shared files on those storage. So those data could be on an Amazon S3 store, on your local compute cluster, on a national facility. Globus handles them all in the same way. A collaborator can then log in and access those data in the same way as you do, without needing accounts on those systems. And then we also support the construction of tools that will integrate these sort of capabilities into other systems. So, for example, the National Center for Atmospheric Research operates a research data archive that uses Globus to manage all of its data access and data download. So all of this can be done using just a web browser. We can access essentially any storage, and we can use any existing identity, your institutional identity, or your Google ID, or other sorts of identities to manage access. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into technical details, but I do want to explain something about how we make use of cloud computing, because I think that's important and also relevant in the context of this particular webinar. So I said that Globus is software as a service. In fact, more technically, it's hybrid software as a service. What this means is that we operate all of the management logic associated with the Globus service, the technology that keeps track of what transfers are active and that ensures that they complete successfully. This is all run on, in fact, Amazon Web Services. That the actual data transfers occur between what we call endpoints, which are storage systems that run a simple Globus Connect server piece of software. So this, for example, here we show a transfer from a source to a destination. The source might be your workstation or laptop. The destination might be a high-performance computing center or a cloud storage system. It doesn't matter what it is. The point is you can ask Globus to move data from one endpoint to another. The actual data transfer occurs directly between the two endpoints over the fastest available network. It doesn't go via the cloud service. But the fact that we're using the cloud to host the management logic means that we can provide high availability, high reliability, and so forth. A very important aspect of the system. And it also allows us to simplify debugging and such like. So there are more than 20,000 active endpoints, as I already mentioned. It's easy to search through and find ones that may be of interest to you. Here I just happen to search for ones associated with the Energy Storage Network, the Energy Sciences Network, which is a Department of Energy network, and you can see there are ones in New York, Sunnyvale, in Geneva, just a few of the more than 20,000 total. But let's go on and say a bit more about this Globus Connect system. So Globus Connect is the software that you install on your computer to make storage systems accessible, the storage system on that computer accessible via Globus. And there are two versions of this. There's a Globus Connect Personal, which I run on my laptop. You could run on your laptop. It's designed for use by a single person. It's basically one-click install, the sort of thing you'd expect if you're using sophisticated Windows, Macs, or Linux software. Importantly, it can handle the complexities of network address translation devices, so that it can operate, even if you have various forms of a firewall in place between you and the network. The Globus Connect server system is a little bit more complex. It's often installed by a system administrator. This is what allows you to provide access to a powerful mass storage system or a high-performance cluster storage system that is intended to be accessed by many users. So the installation there is a little bit more complex, but still fairly straightforward. One important aspect of this picture, in very small font, DTN down here, let me say a bit more about that. An important innovation that's occurred over the last 5 or 10 years is a set of innovations in terms of how one provides access to high-speed storage systems despite the existence of enterprise firewalls and so forth. And this slide gives you a bit of detail on this. So as we increasingly protect our computer systems on campuses, in hospitals and elsewhere, we see firewalls being deployed that filter incoming traffic. A challenge with firewalls is that they tend to prevent high-speed data movement. So research institutions increasingly deploy systems called science DMZs. These are systems that can be accessed without going through the firewall for access to large scientific data sets. And these systems will often run one or even in some cases up to 20 or more data transfer nodes, special nodes that are set up to run Globus software and other mechanisms required for high-speed data movement. So this is why you're able to access data using Globus at 100 gigabits per second in some institutions, and certainly at 10 gigabits per second in many other institutions, because these science DMZ mechanisms are in place. Okay, a few more words about storage connectors. You know, if you run a conventional Linux cluster with a conventional file system, or you run a laptop, then, well, standard Globus connectors work just fine. But we see more and more specialized storage systems, often high-performance object stores being created, or systems like Amazon S3, Box, etc., which have you know, different sorts of interfaces. So we have Globus Connect interfaces to many of these systems, and that means that you can use exactly the same Globus mechanisms to move data, to manage sharing of data on to from those sorts of storage systems as well. So you can, I can trivially move data from my local high-performance computing system to Amazon S3, for example, by using the Globus web client. One recent development in the Globus ecosystem is integration of support for high assurance data management. So, you know, I've explained that Globus is a cloud-hosted service to which you make requests to move data from one storage system to another, to control who's allowed to access data on a storage system, an endpoint, as we call it. The data itself never flows through the cloud; it flows over the intervening network. So that is, you know, in itself a perfectly fine way of moving research data. There's support provided for, you know, strong authentication, for encryption if you're concerned with the security of your data. But we also wanted to allow people to use it for, you know, PHI, personally identifiable information, etc., that is subject to various security controls regarding the management of the data, the credentials that are used to access the data, and so forth. So with support from the National Cancer Institute, we've been able to develop the extensions to Globus required to permit its use for PHI, PII, and CUI. And these extensions have primarily been around the processes that are used to manage access to the Globus service, although there's some minor changes to the service itself, for example, ensuring that file names, which could contain personal health information like patient names, are not transferred without being encrypted. So we've now set up things so you can negotiate a business associate agreement with the University of Chicago, and a growing number of biomedical research institutions are starting to do that, so they can use Globus to move data associated with their biomedical or social science research institutions. I'm told, I haven't been involved in the UK-EU discussions, but the same rules will apply in that context as well, so we can use these mechanisms in the European context. So that's pretty exciting. We're starting to see more and more people use Globus for biomedical data. In fact, at Argonne, we have the biomedical learning enclave, as we call it, and we use Globus to move data to and from that system. Okay, moving on here. I want to now drill down. So far we've sort of explained why we created Globus, talked about the fact that it lets you move data between any Globus endpoint and another, and manage who's allowed to access data on that endpoint. So let me now say a bit about how you actually use the Globus service in practice. So the first way you use it, and this is probably still the most common usage modality, is via a web client. So the Globus web client shown here at the top of the screen, is a bit like any other file transfer clients that you might have seen. It lets you, select, search for, and select from among endpoints where data may be located that you want to manage sharing for, or transfer data from, or transfer data to. You can see here I've got mostly various test endpoints shown here, because I think this is a screenshot from a tutorial. I've got a few that I've pinned, bookmarked, an Amazon S3 endpoint and a Box endpoint. There's the option to observe transfer activity, see how transfers are performing. I can manage the groups that can be used to control access to a particular endpoint. I can set up a group of Globus users and then share different data and directories with those endpoints, and so on and so forth. And I've also got my account information, which I won't say much more about, except to say that my Globus account, in this case it's a user called Vas Vasiliadis, who works for the Globus team. Your account can have associated with it different credentials. So I normally authenticate to Globus using my University of Chicago credential. But if I'm accessing resources at Argonne National Lab, I need to use my Argonne credential with its two-factor authentication mechanisms. And so the Globus knows that I have both of those mechanisms and can use the appropriate one in different cases. And here I'm showing the files that are available to transfer. So you can see there's a 100 gigabyte file, a 100 megabyte file, a whole range of different things that I might decide to transfer in this case. So the web client works the way you would expect. It's what you would want to use if you're engaged in day-to-day work of your day-to-day research work, and you need to move data from one place to another. On the other hand, of course, as we all know, doing things by hand, even if convenient, becomes painful if you need to do them again and again. So Globus also supports a command line interface, which means that you can quickly script some automated process, move all of the genomic data files on this endpoint to a number of other endpoints, for example, or set up sharing for this file, and then maybe I run a program every day to move additional data into that shared endpoint. And then finally, there's a REST API and actually a Python the software development kit associated with that makes it easy to write application programs that will automate Globus activities. So I think I will now show you some examples of the sorts of things that these APIs, application programming interfaces, can be used for. And in fact, what we see is a growing number of people using this Globus service as a platform for building what people sometimes call science gateways or web portals, web-based systems that provide access to computational capabilities, and also a range of other applications that support various research and education use cases. So here's a couple of examples. The National Center for Atmospheric Research runs a research data archive, the so-called NCAR RDA, that provides access to, I think, a couple of petabytes of environmental, climate, and related simulation and observational data. So, a typical use case here is someone comes in, they search, find interesting data sets, they add them to a shopping cart, like you would when you're buying things on Amazon. Once they've collected a set of data, they then can request that they be downloaded to their local computer or transferred to another computer, for example, an institutional repository or an Amazon storage system. And under the covers, well, initially, when they first built the system, they handled user management, transfer, all of these things themselves. The result was, quite expensive to maintain and actually somewhat unreliable. Now they have basically handed off responsibility for those tasks to the Globus service. So they've rewritten their portal to make calls to the Globus APIs whenever they want to initiate a data transfer, or in fact, when someone requests that data be added to a shopping cart, they make a copy of it in a shared area that only that user is able to access using other Globus API calls. And when the user completes their transfer, they then delete those saved data, perhaps after a certain time period, so they can be available for other purposes. At the upper right, we show a somewhat actually quite similar portal, but in this case developed for the advanced radiation monitoring system of the Department of Energy. So again, this allows you to identify, select, and transfer data for download from that system. Here's two other examples. One biomedical. So the Sanger imputation service. If you are an audience, I would ask people to put their hands up if they've used it, but I don't think that will work too well. If you have some GWAS data, for example, 23andMe data obtained from that genotyping service, you can upload it to this imputation service run by the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute. It will perform a computation on your behalf, basically an imputation computation, and then notify you that the results are available to download onto your computer. And they do that, in fact, all of the upload and download is handled using Globus mechanisms. Turns out to be quite a convenient way of handling those things for them, because they can use the Globus service, first of all, to create a shared endpoint for you to upload your data to, use Globus to perform the upload reliably and securely. And then once they're done, once they've completed the result, they create a new shared endpoint into which they place the imputation results and then notify you that download is available from that point. The fourth example here I won't say much about, but DL Hub is a service for discovering and finding, sharing, publishing, and running machine learning models and associated data. And they also use Globus mechanisms under the covers for authentication, data movement, data sharing, and so forth. Let me give you here's another set of examples. The advanced photon source I've already mentioned. So they have some interesting data management challenges there. There are something like 60 beam lines, each of which has potentially many users coming in per week. I think it's more than 6,000 per year visit Argonne to use the advanced photon source. And each of those collects data that needs to be eventually returned to their home institution. So how do they handle that? Well, at least at some subset of the beam lines, they've set up a automated system that uses Globus APIs, so that before a user arrives at the beam line, they query their local scheduling system to determine the user IDs of the people who are coming. They create a shared Globus endpoint on a large storage system at Argonne using Globus APIs. And then as data is collected, they automatically transfer the data to that endpoint, which is accessible by all of the users registered as being associated with that experiment. So the result is that people can access those data automatically without them having to have local accounts or any manual management being performed for those data. So let me now go on and talk about some other aspects of the use of Globus APIs for automation of data movement. So this is a topic of great interest to me because, and I think to a growing number of our users, because we see more and more scientists engaging in increasingly automated scientific use cases. So this picture sort of captures, what we see being deployed increasingly at places like the Advanced Photon Source, the Advanced Light Source, other high-end experimental facilities, and at places like the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility, the University of Chicago's Research Computing Center, and other high-end computing facilities. These are systems in which it's not simply the case that a user sits there, performs an experiment, downloads the data somewhere, and then engages in analysis, but they run systems that perhaps automatically collect data, automatically download data, and automatically analyze the data. Perhaps in some cases even providing real-time feedback that will drive subsequent experiments. So let me give you a few examples of how such systems are being built and how people are using the Globus service to automate their operation. So I've already talked about the Advanced Photon Source. Other facilities, cryo-EM devices, scanning electron microscopes, etc., have similar use cases. So here's one example, the Bobby Kasthuri at the University of Chicago. He has the ambition of being able to image centimeter cubed brains eventually. He's working more on millimeter cubed at the moment, and you're working with millimeter or centimeter squared sections of these brains. Synchrotron can be used to image these at up to 20 gigabytes per second. The goal is to be able to segment these and generate visualizations for the community. And so there's a fair bit of machinery that underpins this, but turns out that it's quite easy to connect the Advanced Photon Source to a remote leadership computing facility, because we're only a kilometer apart. Although actually with our networks we could easily move the data far more to far more distant locations as well. So here's the sort of infrastructure that they are operating. The Advanced Photon Source is imaging the data, acquiring it, performing pre-processing. It's being previewed, and there's some basic centering going on at the Leadership Computing Facility. A user has to validate that the centering is being performed correctly. Then the reconstruction proceeds using a reconstruction pipeline. The data is then published to a large storage system called Petrel. Ultimately, remote users can then visualize the data using visualization systems running on the Petrel storage service, and users around the world, in fact, can access the resulting data. Now, the goal then is to automate this pipeline. What makes it easy is that each of these systems is running a Globus endpoint, and so we can build a system that will automate this process via a series of basically if this then that rules, so that when data is generated and acquired at the lab server, the arrival of that data detected by Globus fires off a pre-processing step. When pre-processing is finished, a transfer is performed automatically to the leadership computing facility. The centering step is performed, triggered by the arrival of the data there. Completion of that triggers a message asking the user to validate the request. It adds it to a queue of validation tasks. Once that is finished, then the neuroanatomy reconstruction pipeline can be kicked off. Completion of that moves the data again to Petrel, where it is published into a catalog, and then users can access it. So underpinning this all is by providing the right cloud hosted services with the right appropriately defined APIs, complex workflows are able to be automated quite easily. So let me come back now to the this original slide and say a bit more about it now that we've got a bit more context. So sort of explain the significance of some of the things on this slide. Well, first of all, I want you to note that in the bottom center, we've got a world map with New Zealand on it. That's very important. It's where I come from originally, and indeed people in New Zealand are using Globus. We have users, well, I think 150 countries worldwide, if I remember correctly. In the upper left, we show the APIs that Globus provides, and I've talked about some of these, but not all of them. So identity management is what allows me to associate with my Globus identity the fact that I have a University of Chicago ID, an ORCID ID, and a Argonne leadership computing facility identity. The access control and file sharing APIs are what allow me to manage access to data on endpoints that I control. The file transfer API is what allows me to move data from one location to another. The workflow automation API, this is a more experimental system at the moment, but it's what I use to implement things like the Bobby Kasthuri neuroscience workflow. Then on the right, we show the different storage systems that we can access and manage. We can access using Globus. We can move data to them, from them. We can manage access to data located on them. So commercial cloud storage, certainly Amazon S3 and others are very important and growing use case. High performance computing centers, tape archives. People still put large amounts of data on tape, and we incorporate optimizations that allow us to move data rapidly to and from tape. The various forms of institutional storage at institutional research computing centers, and then different forms of local storage within a single lab, within someone's office, on someone's laptop. Some of the other things on here that perhaps are interesting. So more than 1,000 connected institutions. I think every Research One institution in the US and many overseas. The number of shared endpoints, these are endpoints that people have configured to allow sharing of data instead of just transfer in and out. There's close to 5,000 of them. We're moving nowadays about a petabyte per day. That's up to about 100 billion files at this point. Registered users, 120,000, not much to say about that. The identity providers is important. So, you know, the chances are we already support your institution's identity provider. If not, it's fairly straightforward to add. And then a registered service or application is a service or application that is set up to use Globus Auth for authentication and authorization. And again, it's pretty easy to add these things. So I want to say two other things about this slide before we move on. One is go to globus.org to find out more about it. And secondly, what is our status? We operate Globus as a production service. We have a highly professional team that operates the service, achieving high availability, high security, supporting the negotiation of BAAs for personal health information. But it's operated by the University of Chicago as a not-for-profit capability. We have many people use it for free, but a number of more than 100 institutions have subscriptions to the service that provides them with access to some premium capabilities. And it's the subscriptions that let us keep operating this service for the research community. So I thought it would be fun to finish with a few stories of why people seem to like it. I hope this doesn't seem like too much like advertising, but I find it interesting to see why people like the availability of this service. So first of all, people simply who need to move data. Now, not everyone has to move hundreds of gigabytes. Sometimes it's just a few hundreds of megabytes. But if you have lots of files in those data, then if you have an unreliable or slow file transfer service, it's going to be difficult to perform that effectively. The Chicago Booth Business School uses it, on the other hand, for sharing large amounts of data with researchers around the world. Interestingly, increasingly we see research institutions using Globus as a means of accessing cloud storage. Increasingly institutions sign up for these various forms of cloud storage services, Amazon, Google, Box, Dropbox. If you can move data in and out of these systems using Globus APIs, that turns out to be quite a convenient thing to be able to do. Oops, so that's all I have to say about Globus. If you want to learn more about it, there's lots of online material as I describe here. You can follow us on Twitter and learn about this webinar, for example. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop me an email. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ian. But we do have a spot here for you to ask your questions, and I have received a few. So please go ahead and ask your questions in the question panel that's in front of you, and you can go ahead and place it there. So the first question is, how is Globus being used in life sciences? Ian, if you could talk about that a little bit. First question we have.
Yeah, we've been, well, Globus is, I'd say, as I sort of mentioned, we started working primarily in the physical sciences, but certainly starting 5 years or so ago, we've been seeing increasing use in the life sciences, just as data volumes have been growing. One common use, in fact, is people using Globus to move data from genome sequencing services to commercial cloud providers, Amazon in particular, for sequence analysis, and then moving results back to their home institutions once sequence analysis has been completed. Another use case is we're quite involved in a number of NIH data commons projects where Globus is being used to move data between different storage providers and the places where analysis is being performed. Initially, people were moving only de-identified data, which a lot of people, at least until recently, viewed genome sequence data as de-identified, rightly or wrongly. But increasingly, we now see them using the high assurance variant of Globus for that purpose.
So we have a question about a gentleman on the call who's in the private industry, so works in the commercial sector, interested in science and science experimentation. Are they allowed to take advantage of your Globus community or the Globus platform?
Yeah, short answer is yes, they are. We have a modest number of commercial users. We have a Globus subscription rate for commercial users, and we'd be happy to talk to them. I mean, we focus on the research community due to their, because we feel that they have unique and important needs, but of course, in many areas they overlap strongly with those of industry as well.
All right. Is there a plan to create a centralized data catalog, stored data schema, and turn Globus into a science data lake? Fascinating question there.
That's a great question. So one of the capabilities that I didn't mention, we do operate catalog services for various groups. We don't, our aspiration in the Globus team is not to operate a global centralized catalog, but to make it very easy for people to set up their own catalogs in different domains. And in fact, we assist people in doing that in various areas. So I mentioned the NCAR Research Data Archive as one. A group at Argonne runs such catalogs for people working in neuroscience, cosmology, some other areas that I'm blanking on for the moment. And basically they're what they use Globus mechanisms to manage the ingest of data. Well, material science, of course, is another. The materials data facility is an example of a data lake that is operated by people funded by, in fact, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, but using Globus mechanisms under the cover.
Okay. So this is about data lineage, it seems. What has been done in terms of citation and data ownership? Is it easy to find the origins of data? Or in other terms, how could researchers be sure that the data is not fake or dummy?
Oh, it's another great question. So yeah, I'll explain how the materials data facility handles that. So they, it's a combination of persistent identifiers for data and checksums, so that you can verify that you can refer to data using a persistent identifier and verify that the data that you download is not being corrupted during the download process. So that at least is a step in the right direction. We also record, in the materials data facility, the provenance of the data, perhaps referring, and that how would that be documented? In some cases, it could be a reference to a journal article that describes it, the identities of the data, and so forth. So it's very much not a single solution, but a process. There's a process by which you try and capture the process by which the data is created, and provide references to relevant points of origin where it can be validated.
Okay, great. How is Globus used in terms of data logs monitoring from the cybersecurity standpoint? In other words, how can companies monitor the traffic of their data?
Right, so that's an interesting question. So we do extensive monitoring ourselves, of course, of data accesses and transfers. The logs themselves, because they are managed under a process that's been validated and audited in in a way that's consistent with HIPAA regulations. So we turn them over regularly and don't maintain identifiable information in them. The individual users can obtain access, the manager of an endpoint can obtain access to log data about the transfers that occur on their endpoint and so forth. So that's certainly been a major focus of the HIPAA approval process that we've gone through.
Okay, great. Another question is, what were the reasons behind your choice of AWS as a platform to support Globus?
Well, yeah, so, I didn't say too much about, all I said was we run on Amazon. I could give a whole talk about how we do that, but we make extensive use of a wide range of Amazon services to operate the Globus management logic. So we obviously run the actual the processes that manage data movement run on Amazon EC2 instances. We maintain log data in S3 buckets. We use various VPN capabilities. We replicate across multiple availability zones so that we can deal with failures in any one of them. There's a whole set of other capabilities that we make use of in order to achieve the high reliability and high performance that we want. And that mix of services is not available in any other cloud provider, at least as far as I know. It certainly wasn't when we started developing Globus. So that's, it's sort of an interesting question. I think a lot of people only think of Amazon and commercial cloud in general as a place where you can get storage and computing, but actually it's a very rich ecosystem of very powerful services that let you do some very interesting things, and that's what we are doing ourselves. We don't actually consume a lot of Amazon resources. It's not like we're running hundreds of CPUs, at least in this for Globus, but the services we do use are essential to providing the capabilities that we do.
Great. And since we do have 1 other minute or 2 minutes to answer one other question, I'm going to ask you one that I had. I know right before the audience joined, you talked about 3 petabytes of data set that you migrated for another organization. Can you tell us what that was, name of the organization, and what happened there? And just share 60 seconds of it, and then we can close.
I think, right. So we have a community that makes extensive use of our services is working in cosmology. So they're simulating virtual universes, and they're, if you like, a bit of a science parasite. They go wherever there's computing resources available, and then they need to move their data off when the computing resources are no longer accessible to them. So recently they finished a 3 petabyte data transfer. I think it was from Oak Ridge to another storage system. In other contexts, they've moved between Argonne and Berkeley and elsewhere. So the fact that you can move 3 petabytes of data in a reasonably modest time frame, I find quite astonishing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for your talk and for addressing all the questions. I just wanted to mention to all that are in attendance that we will have the slides and this recording available on our research webinar page. I've also dropped it as part of the Q&A response, and you're more than welcome to access the materials from there. So thanks again all for joining. Have a wonderful afternoon. Have a good one, Ian.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.